Good morning, everyone. My presentation is going to be about laws of nature, dispositions, and pragmatics. So first of all, let me explain this title. I will talk about laws of nature and more precisely about a very interesting kind of scientific law, which are the Catrespirables laws. Dispositions, by dispositions here, I'm meaning dispositional properties. So this talk is going to be about the dispositional realism, the thesis according to which dispositional properties are real and the role they can play in getting a better understanding of Catrespirables laws. And the pragmatics expression here means that the focus of my presentation will be the use of Catrespirables laws and the methods we got to test this kind of law. This presentation and this talk is part of the research that I'm currently advancing in my PhD thesis. So of course it is work in progress and it will be a very nice opportunity to discuss all these ideas with you. So a brief outline for this presentation. There are precisely 6 parts. In the first part, I'll try to define and to provide some examples for Catrespirables laws. What does this mean? What does concept mean? In the second part, I'll try to briefly sketch 3 main views or 3 main accounts we may have for explaining Catrespirables laws. In the third part, I'll briefly talk about semantic approaches for solving the problems involved in Catrespirables laws, but my emphasis will be in ontology because I'm going to talk about dispositional properties. I will try to claim that in order to get a better understanding of Catrespirables laws and the role that dispositional properties can assume in explaining this kind of laws, we have to clarify the issue concerning 2 main topics, namely pragmatics and the classification of Catrespirables laws, because in great part of the debate about these laws in philosophy of science, philosophers take Catrespirables laws as one simple kind of law, and there are various kinds of Catrespirables laws, and we have to account for these differences. In the end of this talk, I will try to provide a dispositionalist framework in order to understand Catrespirables laws, and I'll try to argue that dispositions are suited to solve some class of problems involving Catrespirables laws, but not other kind of problems. So let's start to the first point, which is trying to define Catrespirables laws and what does it mean to say that a scientific law needs a Catrespirables clause. So in general, philosophers of science usually think of law of nature as exceptionless generalizations. So let's think about classical mechanics, the total force law. Law is supposed to be in charge everywhere because laws of nature are universals, so they are exceptionless. However, Catrespirables laws are scientific laws which describe the behavior of systems, taking for granted that certain interfering factors remain constant. So Catrespirables laws may be defined as scientific laws with exceptions. Of course, this is not a very precise definition, but it's one definition from which we can start. Some examples of laws that are usually thought about by philosophers of science as Catrespirables laws. We have, for example, Snell-Descartes law concerning the reflection of light, the refraction of other waves. Snell-Descartes law is a Catrespirables law because it assumes that the interface which the light is propagating is isotropic. So the Snell-Descartes law cannot explain exactly the refraction of light when the media are not isotropic. So since you assume this condition for the law to hold, we can classify this law as a Catrespirables law. In economics, we have the supply and demand law. If the supply of a commodity is kept constant and its demand increases, then it leads to higher equilibrium prices. It is a Catrespirables law because you need to suppose that the markets are in equilibrium, the economic agents act rationally, and a lot of assumptions you need to do in order for the law to hold. And in some kind of folk medical science, we can have the claim smoking causes lung cancer. And this claim here is Catrespirables because you can have the antecedent without having the consequent. We can have smoking without necessarily having lung cancer. So in order for the laws to be true, you need to add a Catrespirables clause. And Catrespirables literally mean other things remaining constant. So the first conclusion we can draw from this brief definition and outline is that Catrespirables laws are present in different branches of science, not only special sciences, but also physics. Some philosophical concerns that are brought by the issue of Catrespirables laws. What is the empirical content of a Catrespirables laws? How to define its true conditions? Since Catrespirables laws need some clauses in order to be true, how can you define precisely the empirical content of this law? Since the antecedent conditions for the law to hold, sometimes you cannot state a closed list for these conditions for the law to hold. So it leads to a problem that Mark Lange once had posed into a dilemma, a destructive dilemma. So according to Lange's, Catrespirables laws are either false or trivial. So they may be false because without the Catrespirables clauses, there are exceptions to these laws. For example, smoking is sometimes not followed by lung cancer. On the other hand, if you put the Catrespirables clause in order to the law to hold and to be true, it may be vacuously true or trivial or uninformative. As the content of a Catrespirables clause is complex, you cannot state it in a complete way. It may lead to statements such as smoking causes lung cancer unless it doesn't, or in other words, the law is true unless it's false. So you get a very trivial statement and a very non-informative one. That's Lange's destructive dilemma. Well, dealing with this problem and the issue of Catrespirables laws in general, there are three main viewpoints we can assume in order to solve these problems. So, the first point of view is radical skepticism. According to these views, only the fundamental laws of physics deserve to be called laws, because only fundamental laws are exceptionless. And special science cannot formulate laws, only explanatory generalizations. So there are not Catrespirables laws in any branch of science. And special science can only provide explanatory generalizations which do not deserve the title of law. That's the position assumed, for example, by Ehrman and Roberts in a very influential paper by 1999. The second position, which is a very radical one too, is that Catrespirables all the way down, because every scientific law needs a scientific Catrespirables clause in order to be true, including the laws of fundamental physics. That's why this position is called all the way down, because it is Catrespirables clauses all the way down from special science to fundamental physics. And many authors, including Ehrman and Roberts, which I quoted above, take Nancy Cartwright's arguments as an evidence of her commitment to this view. And later, I will argue that this is not the case. Cartwright, as I take her arguments, she's not defending a radical view of Catrespirables all the way down. Her arguments are more akin to a third way position, which is a kind of mid-term between positions 1 and 2. In the third way, fundamental laws are regarded as strict, but Catrespirables laws are scientifically legitimate and viable. Okay, in the third moment of my presentation, I will just briefly mention some semantic attempts of solving the problems concerning Catrespirables laws and how these reflections can lead us to some solutions in ontology. So, a semantic approach to Catrespirables laws concerns facing the task of providing true conditions for statement of Catrespirables laws, or in short, CP laws. There are a lot of different attempts in the semantics of Catrespirables laws, but the problems this kind of approach deal with these problems are very known in philosophy of science. That's why some philosophers like Cartwright, Alexander Bird, Anyan Chakravarti, and other ones propose a dispositional interpretation for Catrespirables laws, not focusing on semantics, but directly in ontology. And in general, a disposition is a property that may not manifest itself. When manifested, a disposition brings about certain effects, and how this can relate to the issue of Catrespirables laws. So, according to dispositional realism, a statement like smoking causes lung cancer Catrespirables can be interpreted as smoking has the capacity to cause lung cancer, and the capacity here is the dispositional property, is a property that can manifest itself when someone who smokes gets lung cancer, but this property, this capacity, can be unmanifested when you have the antecedent condition, a person who smokes, without the consequent one, without getting lung cancer. So this would solve, in principle, the problems of the undeterminate content, the dilemma posed by Lange for Catrespirables laws. Here a quote from Nancy Cartwright. Mechanics provides no model for this situation. We have only a partial model which describes the $1,000 bill as an unsupported object in the vicinity of the Earth, and thereby introduces the force exerted on it due to gravity. Is that the total force? Some falling objects, indeed a very great number, will be outside the domain of mechanics, or only partially affected by it. Here in this quote, it is some of the reasons that a lot of philosophers take Cartwright as a defender of the position of Catrespirables laws all the way down, because in this quote, she's dealing with the problem of the gravitational law and the fact that gravitational law alone is not able to predict the behavior of a $1,000 bill that are thrown in a park or in a place where we have a lot of wind. What Cartwright is trying to do in this argument, she's trying to say that the range of application of laws is a very limited one. because laws are about capacities. You have laws about capacities, but what the capacities will do, if the capacities will be manifested or if they will not be manifested, it depends in each situation. So saying that the laws of nature are about capacities, including the fundamental laws of physics, they are about capacities, it doesn't mean to say that we have Catrespirables laws all the way down to fundamental physics. I'll return to this topic later. Of course, the ontology of dispositional realism faces a lot of drawbacks, a lot of problems that are not solved easily. And the three main ones are the following. First of all, dispositional ontology do not solve the semantic problem of Catrespirables laws. We still do not know the truth conditions for these laws, because telling that a capacity is the truth conditions for these laws, considering that a capacity is an unobservable properties, it may not solve the semantic problem of Catrespirables laws, especially if we are dealing with an empiricist philosopher who do not believe in dispositions. Actually, the dispositionalist interpretation may be classified as redundant because the Catrespirables clause is only rephrased, but we need it to be explained. So dispositions, according to this view, will be insufficient, will be not enough to deal with Catrespirables laws. So what are the criteria for identifying and individuating capacities? Capacities, as every dispositional property, need to be individuated and identified, and we need criteria for that. And the third problem, does the dispositional realism require fundamental laws of physics to be Catrespirables? In other words, does dispositional realism commit itself with the position of Catrespirables laws all the way down to fundamental physics? So in order to solve this kind of problems, I argue that we need to clarify the issue concerning pragmatics and the classification of Catrespirables laws. So I'll start with the pragmatics. We need to distinguish what is a pseudo exception to a law and what is a real exception to a law. And here I quote Marcus Schrenk in a very important book called The Metaphysics of Catrespirables Laws. According to Schrenk, a law might have an apparent exception or falsification because its consequent property is, while fully instantiated, counteracted or diluted by other events. Think of a multitude of forces, gravitational forces, electromagnetic forces, all acting upon a single body, an electron, for example. The law of gravitation alone will seem to have an exception if the other forces are disregarded in a prediction of the electron's trajectory. So a pseudo exception is basically a condition. We have a Catrespirables laws, you have the Catrespirables condition, and the condition is not satisfied. So you regard this case as an exception. However, it is fully covered by the Catrespirables conditions, so it is not a real exception. Sorry. It is not a real exception because it is a case covered by the Catrespirables condition. A real exception is a case where you have the law, the conditions are satisfied, and the consequent does not hold. That is a real exception to a law. And a lot of authors in philosophy of science argue that in order for us to deal with Catrespirables laws, we need to deal with real exceptions. However, as I take Nancy Cartwright's arguments and her examples, she is dealing with pseudo exceptions. And although we talk about pseudo or weak exceptions, from the point of view of metaphysics of science, these are the exceptions that are very interesting because in a having a pseudo-exception means that a law has a range of application, a restricted range of application. And this fact leads to more interesting conclusions because it deals with the use of laws. Excuse me. And that's why I'm using the term pragmatics here, because we're dealing with the use of laws. So we need, besides from talking about pragmatics, we need some clarification about the classification of laws. Basically, a Catrespirables laws, according to Schurz, may be a comparative one or an exclusive one. A comparative Catrespirables laws correspond to the expression all other things being equal. And here we have some examples. Gay-Lussac's law that relates the pressure and temperature of a gas. It is Catrespirables because it needs that the volume of the gas be kept constant. These are comparative laws. And we have, on the other hand, exclusive Catrespirables laws. This kind of laws relates to the expression all other things being right. And exclusive Catrespirables laws can also be regarded as Cateris absentibus or Cateris rectis, because it needs that some factors to be excluded. So, in the third point, it corresponds to the expression other things being right, and some examples are the Snell-Descartes law about refraction, which I talked about earlier, and some other folk medicine law, aspirins relieve headaches, because you have to exclude a whole bunch of events in order for this law to be true. So exclusive laws can be definite or indefinite, depending on our ability to identify which factors must be excluded so that the law holds. And especially the indefinite exclusive laws pose serious difficulties to the philosophers of science trying to provide ontological frameworks or accounts for explaining this kind of law. Okay, so how can we provide a dispositionalist framework for accounting to comparative and exclusive Catrespirables laws, especially exclusive indefinite laws? What are the contributions of dispositional realism to the discussion about Catrespirables laws? The undetermined character of some Catrespirables clauses do not pose any threat to the definition of capacity's identity, for a definite law can provide the causal information we need to individuate capacities. In addition, both the definite and the indefinite laws are tested the same way. Concerning metaphysics of science more generally, dispositional realism can provide a unified picture of science as the aim of scientific research as interpreted as the pursuit for better understanding of capacities' identities and how they interact. So when I say that definite and indefinite laws are tested the same way, the argument here is that in both cases, you need to try to isolate the interfering factors in order for the capacity to manifest itself. Whether you have already a closed list of the Catrespirables conditions, which is the definite case, you can have a method so that you can separate and isolate the interfering factors, and physics provide this kind of methods. In the indefinite case, when you do not have a method for directly separate and isolate the interfering factors, you can proceed with randomized experiments. And these methods alone are sufficient to isolate the system and display the capacity's manifestation. So just in conclusion, because the time is already 25 minutes, I try to argue in this talk that Catrespirables laws are remarkably interesting from the point of view of metaphysics of science. I try to argue that we do not need a full list of Catrespirables conditions for a law to have empirical content. Neither comparative nor exclusive Catrespirables laws pose serious threats to dispositional realism. Friends of dispositions do not need to embrace all the way down view on Catrespirables laws. Dispositional realism is a promising framework for accounting for Catrespirables laws, or at least some of them, the definite and indefinite exclusive Catrespirables laws. So here are some references, and thank you so much. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Renato. So we have 5 minutes for questions, commentaries. So there is this question Q&A box. So I have a question about, Julio de Riso. So I'm gonna.
Hi, hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks, Renato, for the talk. Maybe I didn't get, I misunderstood you, but this is a worry one might have. So dispositions have manifestation conditions. So was my impression that the proposal of dispositional realism wanted to maybe paraphrase laws in terms of dispositions, but don't we get the same problem, or at least a very closely related problem, once we get dispositions in there, because we need to specify the manifestation property. So, and there we need to exclude some blockers or some conditions that were they to obtain, then the disposition would not manifest itself. So won't that be a problem for the dispositional realist view?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Julio, for your question. It is indeed a big problem for dispositional realism, because one of the charges that dispositional realism faces is precisely that, well, you're just rephrasing, we're giving different names to the same things, but you're not explaining how these things work. If you, in the start, you have an undetermined law, Catrespirables, which cannot be fully stated, you end up with a capacity with a disposition that also cannot be fully understood or defined. The point I tried to make is the following, is the point that you don't need to get a full list of the disposition conditions in order for you to get a clear identity for a disposition, because once you link the disposition to its characteristic manifestation, science provides methods for us to isolate the other interfering conditions, even when we don't know exactly what are those conditions. If you have randomized control experiments, randomized control trials, these methods try precisely to isolate the capacities in order for it to be fully manifested. So you need to get a full list of all the things that might get wrong and you don't have the capacity manifesting itself in order for you to have an ontologically respectable property, let's say this way. But of course, I assume that this is a very problem for a big problem for dispositionalists, and particularly, as I quoted Nancy Cartwright, in her arguments, we lack a very clear account of dispositional properties identity. So that's what I'm trying to develop in my research.
So we have reached the time, 10:35. Thank you, Renato.